Hello and welcome to our next computer side chat, and of course welcome back from break. Today we're going to start our congressional unit, and we're going to start by talking about some very basic things with regards to Congress. Some of this stuff is going to be a review. It's things that we talked about back when we did our Constitution unit around the end of quarter one, beginning of quarter two. So some of this stuff you'll be familiar with, some of it's going to be new information to you. All of it is going to be relevant and need to know information as we begin to go through this unit, though. So let's go ahead and get underway. So first, let's start by looking at our bicameral legislature, which we call Congress. Now, if you remember, bicameral means that Congress is split into two chambers. The upper chamber, which is the Senate, and the lower chamber, which is the House of Representatives. Let's start by talking about the lower chamber, which is the House. So the House has 435 members in it, elected across the 50 states. Representation is proportional to a state's population. In other words, if you remember back to our constitutional unit, that means the larger your population, the more representatives that your state gets. So in other words, California, which has a massive population, has a ton of representatives, while Montana, which has a very small population, does not have very many at all. How this proportional part of representation is decided, in other words, how many representatives are given to each state, is decided during a process called reapportion. And this is every 10 years, a census determines what share of the 435 states each state gets. So that's what reapportion is. And that process takes place every 10 years, and it determines both how many members in the House each state gets, as well as how districts within those states are drawn. That's a subject we'll come back to later. The next reapportion or census actually comes up in 2020. So we are almost there to that point. It is expected that Ohio's number of representatives will actually drop from the 16 that we currently have. Next is the Senate. Now, the Senate has 100 members, and in this chamber, representation is equal. Each state has 2 senators. Now, if you look at these pictures here at the top next to the House of Representatives, you can see what the House chamber looks like. Whereas at the bottom here, you can see a picture of what the Senate chamber looks like. And these are in opposite ends of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And you can see, obviously, the Senate chamber is much, much smaller than the House chamber. And we'll talk about something when we get to our executive branch unit called the State of the Union, which takes place in the House of Representatives, largely because it has a lot more room to accommodate all the people that are there for that event. But that's something that we'll get to later. Let's move forward. Let's move on to talking about the people that make up Congress, and let's once again start with the House. Now, to review something that we've talked about before, term length in the House is 2 years. That means that every single House representative only serves a 2-year term after being elected. All 435 members come up for re-election every 2 years. Specifically, they come up for re-election in even-numbered years. So 2018, 2020, 2022, so on and so forth. In terms of qualifications to get into the House, there are both formal and informal qualifications. Formal are things that you absolutely must meet. Informal are things that are not required, but generally we see these type of qualifications or characteristics throughout most members of the House of Representatives. Formal qualifications include that you need to be 25 years of age, you need to have been a U.S. citizen for at least 7 years, and you need to live in the state that you represent. More specifically, you should also probably live in the district that you are planning to represent as well. So those are written in the Constitution. You must meet those requirements in order to run for and be elected to the House of Representatives. Now, as for informal requirements, things that are not required necessarily, but are helpful to have and usually are things that will help you get elected to the House. Those include things like the ability to campaign effectively, in other words, getting people motivated to come out and vote for you. It's beneficial to be wealthy, or if you're not wealthy, you need to have the ability to raise money really effectively. We've talked about it before when we talked about it in our elections unit. Elections are expensive. You need to be able to afford to run a campaign and advertise for yourself and get your name out there so people will actually vote for you. And lastly, generally we see members of Congress have some kind of background as either a lawyer or someone that has been in business or owned a business. Again, that's not a requirement. There's not to say there aren't people in Congress that have been teachers in the past or engineers or scientists. It's just that generally we see lawyers and business people tend to be the ones that get elected to the House or to the Senate. Now you can see here, this dotted figure here shows the makeup of the House after the 2018 election. There are 235 Democrats, 199 Republicans, and as of the recording of this video, you can tell at the bottom there's that one white dot. That is because there is one seat that has not actually been decided yet. We are still trying to figure out who is going to hold that seat. We're going to talk about important people and important positions within Congress later, but in the House, one individual that is important for you to know right now is the Speaker of the House. And the Speaker of the House is effectively the head of the House of Representatives. Because the Democrats are the majority party in the House, the current Speaker of the House is a Democrat, and that individual is Nancy Pelosi, who you can see pictured here. All right, on to the Senate. So, Senate term lengths are 6 years. For formal qualifications, you must be 30 years of age. You must have lived in the U.S., been a U.S. citizen, I should say, for at least 9 years. And you need to live in the state that you would end up representing if you are elected. For informal qualifications, they're very similar to the ones that we talked about with the House of Representatives. The only difference is in the Senate, it's kind of expected that you have political experience. If you remember, again, back to our constitutional unit, we talked about the fact that the Senate is the upper chamber, means that they are the senior chamber, the more experienced, the more well-respected. So political experience is an informal qualification for the Senate. That said, beyond that, it's the same as the House. The ability to campaign effectively, wealthy, or the ability to raise money, and then lastly, some kind of background as a lawyer or business person generally is beneficial. Now, again, we can see kind of this dotted makeup of the 100 members of the Senate. The Republicans currently hold the majority in the Senate with 52 seats. Democrats have 45, and then there are 2 yellow dots here. Those represent the 2 independents in the Senate. They both tend to caucus or vote with the Democrats. So we tend to count them along with the Democrats, even though they're technically not part of the party. And again, while we're not going to go over major positions within Senate leadership until later, one individual that you're going to want to be aware of that is considered the quote-unquote head of the Senate is the majority party leader. So whoever holds the majority in the Senate gets to elect the majority leader in the Senate. That individual currently is a Republican by the name of Mitch McConnell, who is pictured here in the top right-hand corner. Let's talk about congressional roles. Because when you are elected to Congress, you don't just show up and vote on bills, which are proposed laws. There are various roles that you are expected to fill. So let's go over those really quickly. First is a legislator, and this is probably the most obvious when we talk about the fact that the legislative branch is in charge of making laws. So a legislator, basically what that means is you study proposals, you draft legislation, and you create public policy. In other words, you create the laws. That's what it means to be a legislator. Next is you act as an agent of your constituents if you're elected to Congress. This means that you are the people's representative in Congress. You represent your constituents, and the constituents are the voters that a member of Congress represents. So our 2 senators from Ohio, their constituents are the citizens of Ohio, and they are our representative in the Senate, and they're expected to act accordingly as representatives to us. Third is as a committee member. What this means is that as a member of Congress, you serve on committees that screen proposals for the consideration of a chamber of Congress. We'll talk more about committees later. Essentially, these are small groups broken off from the entire body of either the House or the Senate that look at proposed bills first before they go to the entirety of the chamber. Fourth is as a servant of the constituents. So we talked about agent of the constituents. You are also a servant to them. That means that you assist your constituents with various tasks and needs. Now, we're going to talk about congressional staffers later and how they fill that role specifically. Lastly, you are, as a member of Congress, a politician. That means that you need to find ways to balance the interests of your constituents with the interests of your party, and to do so in a way that ensures that you don't lose the support of either of those groups. Now, when we talk about not losing the interests of those two groups, that means that members of Congress kind of have to toe a line and figure out what their mindset is going to be as they make certain decisions. And so when we talk about the mindset of congressmen and women and how they vote and how they make the decisions that they make, generally they approach that with three different mindsets, either as a delegate, a trustee, or a partisan. Let's talk about delegates first. So if you approach your job as a delegate, what that means is that you act as agents of your constituents, that your decisions should be driven by the will of the voters in your state or in your district. In other words, you're not so much thinking about things from the perspective of what you want, you're thinking about things from the perspective of what your constituents want and voting on laws or bills accordingly. Next is a trustee. Now, trustee, basically that means that each decision must be made on its merits and voting on issues based on your own personal preferences. In other words, when your constituents elected you, they elected you not just to act as their representative, but they elected you on the basis of your judgment, that you should be able to make decisions on your own and that they are trusting you to do that for them. So in other words, the majority of constituents maybe will disagree with what the decisions you make. But because they elected you and because they put their trust in your hands and they trusted your judgment, you have the right to make that decision free of your constituents' influence. Last kind of mindset to approach things in Congress is as a partisan. Now, what that means is that you would owe your first allegiance to your party. Voting decisions are primarily made based on whether you are a Democrat or Republican, and if the Democrats or Republicans want you to vote a certain way. So you're not so much worried about your own judgment or the judgment of the people that vote for you. You are worried about your party's interests. All right, last thing, let's talk about congressional staffers. So congressional staffers are the people hired by members of Congress. So if you get elected to the Senate or you get elected to the House, you don't do everything on your own. You might be the one doing the interviews on news programs. You might be the one that actually casts the vote in the Senate or the House. But there's also a team of people behind you that do a lot of the dirty work so that you as a member of Congress don't have to worry about it. Now, that work breaks into one of two categories, either constituent work or policy work. Let's start by talking about constituent work. Constituent work includes things like taking questions and feedback from constituents from a member of Congress's district or state. So when a voter calls into a member of Congress's office to either complain about a vote that they took or to try and influence them to vote one way or the other, it is a congressional staffer's job to take that phone call, try to explain the mindset of that member of Congress, and then take down any feedback from that person that is calling. They also help constituents or organizations solve problems, such as how to navigate certain bureaucratic hurdles. And then lastly, they also do certain administrative things that are really just either taking care of certain paperwork or needs for constituents, or offering services that are really just a benefit to constituents, like giving tours of the Capitol building if people tend to be in Washington or happen to be in Washington, D.C. at a given time and want to take a tour of the building. So that's constituent work. It's basically working with the voters and trying to do things for them and hear from them and get their feedback. Next is policy work. And so policy work deals with the actual lawmaking side of things and the actual voting side of things. And so that includes things like helping that congressman or woman write drafts of bills or propose legislation. It includes researching issues and providing information to the members of Congress about how certain things affect a given issue. And then lastly, that also includes collecting polling data to see how certain special interest organizations or how voters feel about a certain issue or a vote, and that can help kind of dictate the decisions that a member of Congress makes. All right, so that is our set of notes to get us started through this unit. I know that was a lot, but go over this. If you need to go back and watch any of the video, feel free to do so. Bring your notes in tomorrow. We will go over this stuff. We'll take our quiz. We'll review over it a little bit, and then we will kind of move on from there. Have a great night, and I will see you in class.